Today on episode 169 of the Author Stories podcast, today's guest is Alan Dean Foster.
There's a lot of sloppy science fiction where people do that, unfortunately, and it's a consequence of the writer not bothering to do research. And it makes for a much better story if everything hangs together.
Hey there, Author Story listeners. This is Kevin Tomlinson from Draft to Digital, and I know that you have a book sitting there just waiting to get out to the world, and you're kind of wondering what the next steps are. So that's why you need to go visit drafttodigital.com/authorstories. That's draft2digital.com/authorstories. And that's where you're going to find all the help you need to go from having a book on your hard drive to having it on someone's Kindle or iPad or other reading device. So go visit drafttodigital.com/authorstories right now.
Thanks for tuning in to the Author Stories podcast. I'm your host, Hank Garner. You can find all of the archives of the show, as usual, at hankgarner.com. And when you're there, like I tell you every week, look over in the right-hand sidebar. There are links there where you can subscribe on any device and any platform that you can think of. Also, if there's a platform that I'm not aware of, please let me know and we'll get the show over there for you. So please subscribe, and when you're there, leave a comment about the show. I'd appreciate it. I'd like to thank our sponsors this week. ThirdScribe.com is there to help you build your author platform. If you're an author, you need to be in control of your author platform. Don't leave it to chance. Don't leave it to social media. Take control over it. ThirdScribe can help you do that. If you're a reader and you want to connect with new writers, ThirdScribe can help you do that as well. Also, I'd like to thank Tales from the Canyons of the Damned. Now 14 episodes in. The newest episode, Tales from the Canyons of the Damned, in Space, number 3. This is the best in pulpy goodness. If you remember those great pulp magazines from when we were kids, this brings back all of the feeling that you enjoyed from that. So go check out Tales from the Canyons of the Damned. Please check the links in the show notes for all of our sponsors, including our new sponsor this week, Ed Gosney. Visit his internet comics archive at edgosney.com and check out all the cool comics in his collection and share your thoughts about your love of comics.
With the oppressive transport authority controlling every aspect of their existence, Leia and her father do what they can to carve out a good life for themselves. Leia spends her nights scavenging and risking capture as she hunts for salvage her father can trade for food and clothing. When Leia takes a bag of salvage from a dying stranger, she and her father are plunged into the world of transport and its war against the terrorist organization, Trace. As transport closes in, Leia will need to decide who she can trust and how far she's prepared to go to save her father's life. The Girl in the City by Philip Harris is the first book in a thrilling dystopian science fiction trilogy set in Michael Bunker's world of Pennsylvania. If you enjoyed books like The Hunger Games and Divergent, you'll love The Girl in the City and its sequels, The Girl in the Wilderness and The Girl in the Machine. All 3 books are available now on Amazon Kindle. Check the show notes for a link. A thirst for revenge sends one man on a deadly journey through the galaxy in the adrenaline-pumping new novel, Galactic Satori Chronicles. Written by Nick Breaker and Paul E. Hicks, this raucous sci-fi adventure introduces Asher, a young man whose world is turned upside down when he discovers that his fiance's death has been directly caused by an imminent alien invasion. In a desire to better understand humans in order to destroy them, these aliens are projecting their consciousness onto unsuspecting men and women, and in the process are learning exactly how to use humanity's own selfishness and greed as weapons against them. Fueled by emotions that the aliens will never understand, Asher bands together with a group of friends. These 4 MIT co-eds are more than meets the eye and go to battle with those who are intent on destroying our planet. Asher takes the fight from Earth to an alien spaceship and back again,
A fight that will either save the planet or doom it. The first installment in an upcoming series, Galactic Satori Chronicles, is an engrossing look at the manipulation of time, mental projection, futuristic technology, and of course, aliens. By Nick Breaker and Paul E. Hicks. Pick up Galactic Satori Chronicles now on Amazon. Link in the show notes. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the story and the storytellers. Today, I have the very distinct pleasure and honor to have Alan Dean Foster on the show with me. If you have been a fan of science fiction and fantasy for any time at all, you know Alan Dean Foster. And it's a great honor to have you, sir. Thank you for coming on the show.
Again, my pleasure.
Yes, sir. I begin each show with a variation of the same question. That question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or a storyteller?
I was a junior in high school, and I was an oddball because out of 3,000 students, I was probably the only one who looked forward to essay tests. And we had a class where we were asked to write some poetry, so I wrote some poetry, and it felt right. It felt good. Now, that didn't mean that I wanted to go on from that point in time and become a professional writer. That didn't really hit me until I was a graduate student at UCLA. But I did feel at that point that this was something that I would enjoy doing for the perceivable future anyway.
Right. Were you a big reader at that time?
I was a big reader from the time I was 4 or 5 years old, as near as I can recall. My parents, when I was 4 years old, gave me a set of little golden books, which I think are still in print in various guises on things like one would be on insects, one would be on birds, one would be on flowers, and I just remember loving them. I still have all of those. I kept them all. And they also bought me subscriptions to, back when you subscribed to comic books, to about a dozen different comics. And I found that a wonderful way to learn how to read, because you automatically associate pictures with words. And if you want to know what's happening in the pictures, you have to ask somebody what the words mean. So if it was up to me, I would throw away all authorized school readers between the 3rd and 8th grade and substitute comic books. And I think we'd have a more literate society.
Oh, I fully agree with you. There's just something about reading because you want to and because the stories matter to you than just dry assignment. I fully agree with you.
Yeah, Jack and Jill makes no sense, and Humpty Dumpty ends too abruptly, and a lot of the stuff that they use to teach kids to read is not, like you just said, anything kids really want to read. They would like to know what Scrooge McDuck and Superman and Wonder Woman are doing.
That's right. That's right. Before that fateful day in the 11th grade, when you premiered your poetry career, had you, when reading some of those early books and comics especially, did you ever envision taking those stories and going in a different direction and making it your own?
Not so much that as wanting to be a part of it. Carl Barks is really responsible for initiating my love of travel through the Donald Duck, and particularly the Uncle Scrooge comic books. And I didn't want to so much take them in a different direction as actually be there with them.
Gotcha. So you said that when you went off to college, you started getting the idea that this is something that maybe you want to pursue. How did that come about?
My senior year at UCLA, I needed a certain amount of credits to get my bachelor's degree. And I had completed all the required courses for my political science degree, and I found out that you could take courses in the film department in film history, which was wonderful. You'd go in, and the professor would talk for 15 or 20 minutes, and then you'd watch Buster Keaton for 3.5 hours. 4 units, same as 4 units of physics. So I started taking a lot of film history courses, and I also took one class in television writing, just, again, because I'd always been a facile writer, and I thought it would be fun and easy, and I did so well at it that I took a couple of screenwriting courses as well with the same results, and I thought, well, gee, this is fun, and why don't I try and write a couple of short stories while I'm at it? And one of them sold. And at that point I thought, wait a minute, maybe there's something here that I can do instead of going to law school and becoming a lawyer. Take a shot at it, see what happens. Can always go to law school later. So I applied to the UCLA Graduate Film School for their screenwriting department. And much to my considerable surprise, I got in. And I then went to my parents, who I had to tell that I wasn't going to law school. Sorry, I wanted to try and become a writer. But you can imagine what their reaction was.
Right.
Sort of like, standing on the beach watching the come towards you. They were very supportive, and I justified it by saying, look, I have a Master of Fine Arts degree from UCLA. I can get into probably any law school in the country. Give me a year and a half. Let's see what happened. And what happened, to make it short, was I sold a couple more short stories, ended up getting my MFA degree, postponed going into the Army postponed going to law school to finish a novel before I went into the Army because I'd been drafted. This was Vietnam era, of course. And the novel sold. And at that point, I really decided that I needed to make a serious effort trying to become a full-time writer. And when I got out of my 6 months basic training, I got a part-time job. And that devolved into another part-time job teaching, which allowed me to work most of the day and kept selling books. And still doing that.
What was that first book that you wrote that got published, and kind of where did the idea for that first success come from?
My first published novel was The Tar I'm Krang, which is still in print, still available. And I wanted to do something, I don't want to say grandiose. I love the idea of traveling. Again, Carl Barks is to blame. And being stuck on one planet, the idea of exploring other planets always appealed to me. My father read science fiction. My uncle, who was a well-known Hollywood producer, loved science fiction, so I was around it. And I thought, well, make your own galactic civilization and go puttering around. And for your lead character, you need somebody who's sympathetic. Orphans are instantly sympathetic, and I'm hardly the first writer to figure that out. Right. And that's how the book came about, really.
You mentioned your love of travel, and there's a definite thread throughout your books where place and ecology and kind of all of these natural forces have a life of their own and really become part of the characters. And you mentioned those early books having an influence on you. Do you notice that influence as you're writing, or is it just something that's so ingrained in you that it just comes out?
A little of both. It depends on the book. Some of my stories are overtly ecologically oriented. Books like Midworld or Drowning World or Sentenced to Prism. I love, again, traveling. So if I want to visit, say, an ocean world, I'll write something like Catch-A-Lot, or a world where life forms are based primarily on silicon instead of carbon. So I'll do something like Sentenced to Prism. And when I'm doing that, I am conscious of the fact that I am writing something like that. I love pulling things together. The idea that if you have a character, for example, who's blue, there needs to be a reason why that alien character is blue. You don't just arbitrarily assign a number of arms or a number of eyes or a type of blood or a color or a haircut or anything else to your alien creatures or your alien environment unless there's a reason for it. And there's a lot of sloppy science fiction where people do that, unfortunately. And it's a consequence of the writer not bothering to do research. And it makes for a much better story if everything hangs together, ecologically speaking.
Right.
Right. You talk about that first book, the Tarim Krang, and that was the first book in the Pip and Flinx series. Is that right?
It was the first one I wrote. It's not the first chronologically. Years later, I did a prequel called For Love of Mother Knot, which is the first story involving Flinx and Pip. But the Tarim Krang is the first one I wrote, yes.
Gotcha. Did you know from the beginning that this would be a long-running series like it has been, or did you just have an idea for the standalone book and then it grew into a series?
Oh, I just wanted to, I wanted to write a book, and the book might sell was nice, and the thought that somebody might pay me money for it was also nice, but the idea that it might still be continuing, the next Flinx and Pip book comes out in September. More than 40 years after the fact is something you don't think about when you're in your 20s. You worry about you continuing past your 40th year, not necessarily something you're working on.
Right. I think a lot of new writers now, though, because the industry, and this is just a business thing, I think, that starts to affect writers. I think a lot of people now, especially genre fiction, think that they have to plan out a series, to be able to sell. What do you think about the difference in the way the industry is now and the way it was when you started writing? And do you think that those industry forces are changing the way we write?
Well, there were private universes, if you will, long before me. There was Poul Anderson's future history series, and of course probably the most famous one is Robert Heinlein's. And Heinlein had a whole outline where stories should go and what time frame they should fit in. So it's been around for a while. The difference between that then and series now is when Heinlein and Anderson were doing it, they were doing it with the idea that excuse me, that these were stories they wanted to tell from the beginning, whereas now, as you say, young writers will set it up with the notion that they're planning to write 10 or 20 books from the beginning, hopefully. I think that's the wrong way to go about it. I think what you do is you write a story you want to write, and in the back of your mind there's the notion that you might want to write more stories in that series, then you kind of keep it as a notion. Unless you're starting out with, say, it's one thing to start out and say, well, I'm going to write a trilogy. It's another thing to start and say, I'm going to write an open-ended series that hopefully will continue until my dying day. I think that limits you creatively, and I think that it's real easy to get bored writing that way, too, because then you become a prisoner of your own series idea, and you figure, well, I plotted this out, I laid it all out, now I need to write book 13, or it's not going to work. And readers will notice that right away. If you get tired of it, they can get tired of it too. Of course, on the other hand, you have people who will read, a biography of a minor character from book 6 just because they love the series so much. And publishers love that, of course.
Of course they do. Of course they do. You didn't follow up that first book immediately with a sequel, did you? Didn't you write something in a different series after that?
No, I actually did. Betty Ballantyne, who bought the Tarim back when she was editing the science fiction line at Ballantyne Books, almost immediately asked me for a sequel. But the book I ended up writing was called Blood Hype, and it veered off in a different direction. And the main characters from the first book, and Flinx and Pip, kind of became background movers in Blood Hype, and it really became the story of two other characters, a human woman named Kitten Kai Sung and her alien companion named Porcupine. And what happened, and this relates back to what I was just saying about series, is that as Flinx and Pip became a long-running series and part of an even bigger series, the Commonwealth series, it became very difficult to fit that second book into his life timeline. And I ended up having to retcon it by adding something at the end of a preceding book and something at the beginning of a subsequent book to try and make Blood Hype fit in there. And frankly, as readers know, if I had to go back again, I would make Blood Hype a non-Flinx and Pip book. But it's there, and the choice was trying to fit it in or pretend it didn't exist. And since it still exists, it was much easier to try and put it in. And it does have other elements relating to the greater Commonwealth sequence that are nice to have around.
Now, speaking of that and kind of rearranging the order of things, would you recommend someone read those books, the Pip and Flinx series, in the order that you publish them, or do you have a preferred reading order that's maybe easier for readers? And if you modify that, do you feel like it changes the story in the way you originally told it?
The Pip and Flinx books all fit within the universe of the Commonwealth, and there are bits and pieces of those books that pop up in other books, and vice versa. So the best way to read them is to read them in chronological order. On my website, there is a complete chronology of not just the Flinx and Pip books, but the entire Commonwealth chronology, starting from the first contact books between humans and the race of aliens that we kind of partner up with, the Thranks, to the last book currently in the series. And I think it's much more enjoyable for anybody to start by reading, and I'm not just saying this to sell books, to start with the first book in the whole Commonwealth sequence and read on through, and then you read the Pip and Flinx books as part of that sequence. So, for example, there may be an independent standalone Commonwealth novel that takes place, let's say, between the Flinx and Pip books number 7 and 8, that might have a couple of lines in it that relate to the 8th Flinx book, which, when it all ties together like that, it makes everything much more enjoyable. That's how I like to read and watch movies that are in sequence. It's so much fun if you're watching a series of, let's say, movies, and you're on the third film, and some character from the first film that you completely forgot about because it was a minor character shows up in the third film, even if only briefly. It's like recognizing an old friend.
Right. In managing a series that's this big and that has some of these tertiary characters like you talk about, that you maybe weave in a little of this and a little of that and bring them back from time to time so that you can give that experience to the reader where they're like meeting that old friend. What kind of tools do you use to manage something that big and that in depth and with so much history and its own folklore and all of that stuff?
A number of years ago, it got very unwieldy pretty quick. And
I bet.
A number of years ago, a couple of fans put together a guide to the Commonwealth just for fun, a 76-page book. And I immediately started using it as a reference. I went over it with them and, adjusted things that needed to be adjusted and fixed factual things that needed to be fixed. But that's also on my website, expanded, and I refer back to it constantly whenever I'm working on a Commonwealth book. There are maps. If you're going to do something, as you say, fairly large like that, you've got to have something to refer back to, whether it's an extended outline or a synopsis, or maps are very useful. And so I do that.
Speaking of outlines, do you are you a heavy outliner when writing one of your novels?
I was when I started because I was naturally unsure of myself. So I would make a 20-page outline before I started writing page 1. And over the years, the outlines got shorter and shorter as I became more and more confident of what I was doing. What I'll do now is I'll get an idea and I'll try to sit down and write it out as 2 pages, let's say. And then I'll go back and I'll go over it and I'll make some adjustments. And as long as I have a beginning and an end, I'll start writing the book. And then the outline will continue to follow the book. And as I'm writing, I'll take pieces of the outline. Say I'm on chapter 5. And if I'm on that part of the outline, I'll put be a paragraph or two usually at the end of where I am in the book, if it's page 38. And as I'm writing, that 2 paragraphs continually expands and contracts, depending on where I am in the book.
Interesting. That's an interesting way to look at it. As you became more confident in yourself and as your in your ability to craft the story, your outlines got smaller. That's not something that you hear very often. That I guess is that just familiarity with the characters and the setting, or is this just I have an idea in my head and I'm skilled enough now that I know how to interpret that idea onto the page?
Yeah, I think I'm confident enough at this point, and have been for a while, to where if I have my 2 pages of outline to start with, that if I start writing chapter 1, I know that one way or another, and it will invariably change in the process of writing the book, I know that I'm going to get to the end. In other words, the car isn't going to break down between LA and New York. I may end up detouring through Wyoming unexpectedly, but I know I'm going to get to New York eventually.
Right. And some of those detours are some of the best things that come out of our writing sometimes. It's those little happy surprises when characters do things that we didn't necessarily plan on.
Absolutely. That is far and away the most enjoyable, other than coming up with a turn of phrase you didn't anticipate. One of the most enjoyable things by far in writing a story is when the characters get developed enough to where they take over and they start telling you what they're going to do, and you want them to do one thing and they wouldn't do another because it doesn't fit them anymore.
I think a lot of readers, me included, came to your work through the gateway of Star Wars and some of your movie adaptations that you've done, and I love the work that you did there, and then that, like I said, it acted as a gateway to then discover all your other works. How did you get started working on the Star Wars books?
I had written a number of novelizations for Del Rey, a terrible Italian film called Luana, a brilliant student film called Dark Star, which I'm sure most of your listeners know, and a number of the Star Trek logs. And I had also written a book called Ice Rigger, which was my 3rd original novel. And the story, as I remember it being told, was that someone at Lucasfilm had read Ice Rigger, or several someones, and thought that it had the same spirit as Star Wars, and that the combination of that factor plus the fact that I'd already done a number of novelizations might make me a suitable person to do the book version of this little film that George Lucas was doing. And that's how it came about. I was asked to go into, I said yes when I was asked, and I was asked to go into the offices of Tom Pollock, who at that time was George's lawyer. Did that, had a brief interview, went very pleasantly, and he said, would I be willing to go out to what was then Industrial Light and Magic, which was a warehouse in Van Nuys, California, and talk to George and see what was going on, and if everything went well, then we'd go ahead and go to contract. So Industrial Light and Magic in Van Nuys was 5 minutes from where I was raised, which turned out to be convenient. And I went out there and talked to some folks and met George, and we had a nice brief meeting. I was very surprised that he had any time for me at all, because I know what was involved in making a film like that, to some extent anyway, and that was how it all happened.
Your work on the Star Wars books is kind of the stuff of legends and myth, literally. If I understand the story right, you were kind of tasked with coming up with a good bit of the backstory that then enabled you to take that script and make a novel out of it. Were you given any guidance at all, or kind of how did that part of the process work?
Well, I don't know how much backstory I contributed, if any. I novelized George's script, and everything in the book is from George's script. anything that ended up as backstory or was used then or later, totally coincidental and wasn't intended. But basically, I was given a script and some of Ralph McQuarrie's initial pre-production paintings and access to a couple of photographs from the set of the characters and such, and was told to go write the book, which is usually the way it is with any novelization. And that was pretty good.
Wow. You book that is a favorite among lots and lots of people, Splinter of the Mind's Eye, and that was some things came out in later movies that kind of upset some of the storyline there. Would you like to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. The Splinter of the Mind's Eye, the contract was for 2 books. Novelization of the film and an original sequel novel. The only stricture that George put on me for the sequel novel was that it had to be written as something that could be filmed on a low budget. The idea being that if the film, Star Wars, was not a huge success or not a huge flop, he wanted to have something in reserve just in case he could make a film on a low budget, utilizing as many of the props and sets and costumes and such from the first film as possible. That's why I set Splinter of the Mind's Eye on a fog-shrouded planet, for example. Eliminates the need for expensive backdrops, and a lot of it takes place underground for the same reason. It's an interesting way to approach writing a novel, but I was traveling again, so I had no problem with that. And people have to remember that Splinter of the Mind's Eye was completed before the film Star Wars was released. So not only did I not have any idea what might change in the future, Nostradamus being dead, and nobody else having any idea either, really, I had to go ahead and write the book based on what was in Star Wars, the screenplay, and what I could come up with in my own mind. And since George approved it, and Gary Kurtz approved it, and Charlie Lippincott approved it, I assumed that everything I put in there at that point in time was okay. The only change I was asked to make was the book opens originally with a fairly complex space battle that forces Luke and Leia down onto this planet Nimbon. And George asked me to take that out and start with Chapter 2 because the space battle would have been expensive to film.
Were you surprised when Return of the Jedi came out and you discovered that Luke and Leia were now siblings?
Well, I'm sure I was the only person on the planet who was surprised. Luke and Leia. I mean, this is an old story, and there's many places to research it on the web. There's a really intense kiss between Luke and Leia that was shot for Empire Strikes Back, that was edited out for obvious reasons. And this is the process of making a series, even if you have everything planned out from the beginning, is extremely difficult to keep everything consistent, and you want to make changes. You can't possibly have everything set in your mind for your next 40 or 50 years of work when you start in your 20s doing something. It just is impossible to do. So things change, and creative impulses shift. And retconning, which we've already talked about, going back and fixing something to try and make it fit into something that takes place 20 years down the line, is an extremely difficult process. So it's a roundabout way of answering your question. Yes, of course, I was surprised, and I've caught hell about it, from people who were born 20 years after the book came out, to go back and, give me nonsense because I didn't, handle Luke and Leia's relationship in Splinter of the Mind's Eye right. All you can do is shrug and say, well, Pharaoh so-and-so didn't know that his descendants 1,000 years down the line were going to do this, and on and on and on and on. All in all, though, I think the book holds up quite well, and if you can get over that one particular piece, certainly, of awkwardness, I think it's still an enjoyable read. And if we could go back and retcon it, it'd fit really nicely between episodes 4 and 5. But that's in an alternate universe.
Well, it's a fantastic book, and there's a reason that so many people love that book. And I posted on social media a picture of Splinter and said that you were coming on the show, and people just went nuts. There's such a rabid fan base that loved that book and loved the stuff that you did. So yeah, you should be proud of that. That's excellent.
There are things in the book that I am very proud of. The way, Leia's battle with Vader at the end, for example, and I suppose you could call me a proto-feminist in certain ways, and other things that are in the book that kind of find their way into subsequent films, which is fine. That's all part of what you do when you do a novelization and sequels in somebody else's universe. Excuse me, I have to get a cat off the keyboard. Okay.
Sure.
If we're disconnected, it's not my fault. The fault of the secret masters of the universe, of whom we have 8. Or whom eight have us.
Right. Speaking of pharaohs, and yeah. So you've done several novelizations of movies. You also you alluded to just a minute ago the Star Trek log work that you did, and a friend of mine, Chris Porto, showed me a picture of all of the originals that he still has from when he was a kid, and that the Star Trek logs were some of the his absolute favorite things ever. Talk about the difference, just a minute, if you would, in writing your own universe and your own characters and stories versus taking something that's pre-existing and novelizing those and putting how much of your own flair and flavor do you get to put into that, or is this just do you approach it as a strict interpretation?
It depends on the studio. To answer the last part of your question, in the old days, it didn't matter so much because people weren't looking at canon and sequels and series. It was just like, well, here's a film, go make a book out of it. And they didn't care so much, and I had more freedom. And you still have a certain amount of freedom, but it depends on the studio and who you're working with at the studio. Because one constant in Hollywood is that people know that they can't direct or they can't act or they can't do the special effects or the costumes or do the backgrounds or run the cameras, but everybody thinks they can write. So once in a while, you'll get some people who say, well, maybe if you change this back to what it was originally, or you didn't do this, or you didn't do that, it would be better. And it's a work for hire in novelization. So you just kind of shrug and do what they want. Doesn't mean you're happy about it, but it's what you have to do if it's a work for hire. With ongoing series like Star Wars, Star Trek, and Alien, there's a lot more concern now for films that don't exist yet. So you might not, in Star Wars novelization of, say, Episode 8, which I'm not doing, you might not be able to do something with the character's hair because somebody might think that character's hair might have an important part to play in as yet unconceived Episode 23. So everybody is a lot pickier. And when you have billions of dollars riding on such minutiae, you have a right to be picky. If it's a film that you expect to be a standalone, and there's not going to be a series, then nobody cares as much. And the person doing the novelization has a lot more freedom. As to the other part of your question, I think I get different enjoyment from different things. Of course, I prefer writing my own original material. Who doesn't? But you also get to do your own director's cut as the novelizer. And if you're a fan of the project, say Star Wars, for example, and they let you do certain things, then it's like you can look at the finished book and say, well, that's my version of the film. And that's what I would have put in the film or taken out of the film or changed in the film if they let me do it. And as a fan, that's what you do. That's what everybody does in the theater or does after the film. And you go to a restaurant, you sit down, and you have something to eat and to drink, and you discuss the film and say, well, it would have been better if this character did this in this scene. So I get to be kind of the uber fan because I actually get to do it in the novelization.
Nice. That's a great way of looking at it. Talk a minute, if you would, about the Spellsinger series. I discovered the first book, Spellsinger, and thought, wow, what a really clever take on magic systems and world building. Where did the idea for that come from?
Well, we got to go back to Carl Barks again, and if you'll notice,
this is a recurring
thing. It
is.
If you'll notice, the first book in the Spellsinger series is dedicated, if I remember correctly, to Carl Barks and Vaughn Baudet. Vaughn Baudet being one of the great underground cartoonists and a big fan of science fiction and fantasy, which he's incorporated into a lot of his work. And I was always mindful of the fact that Barks was not able to do a lot of the things with his funny animal characters that he might have wanted to do. There's a very famous incident, for example, in one of his great stories called Back to the Yukon, where Scrooge McDuck goes back to the Yukon as a young person and meets the owner of a bar who basically gets him drunk and rolls him, and he gets dumped outside of town, wakes up, goes back into town, goes back into the saloon, beats up everybody in the saloon, and kidnaps the the bar owner, a gal named Glittering Goldie, and puts her to work in kind of enforced slavery, if you will, on his mining claim to teach her how hard the miners work for their gold. And 2 of those pages were censored. They were taken out of the comic and have long since been restored in reprints of the Barks story. And I kept thinking of stuff like that, and then Baudet's things as well. Baudet challenged the funny animal genre. I mean, his funny animals and characters do really awful things many times. Sometimes awful and funny in the same strip. And I thought, what if Vaughn Baudet and Carl Barks had collaborated? And Vaughn would have loosened up Carl a little bit. Carl would have added a little adventure and real storytelling to some of Vaughn's stuff. What would you end up with? And that was kind of the inspiration, not literally, but subjectively, for the first Spellsinger books.
Awesome. What about how did you come about building the magic system and deciding how to kind of set the world for this?
Well, that's the Barks world of funny animals with humans in it, where the animals maybe sometimes aren't so funny, where they act like real persons, real characters, and there's blood and guts and sex and backstabbing and a normal world, in other words, only with quote-unquote funny animals. As far as the magic goes, I wanted magic in it, and the idea was that this UCLA student, who also can't decide whether he wants to be a lawyer or a rock guitarist, works part-time as a janitor and a wizard in another world to help with a forthcoming battle against the bad guys, needs a wizard from our world to help. So he reaches across the dimensions to pull an engineer, which is our equivalent to what you'd call a wizard, and he gets a sanitation engineer, which is our janitor hero. And as it turns out, as you know, in the course of the book, his music playing abilities turn out to enable him to generate magic through the songs he sings. Unfortunately, it's rarely what he expects. It often works, and sometimes it doesn't. So the magic's in the music, and it all works out very well, and they have lots of adventures. And it's not. I wanted to also fight the standard fantasy. I wanted to write a fantasy that wasn't your standard wizard with the long white beard and charming little dwarves and happy pixies and beautiful princesses being rescued by a gallant hero on a white horse and all of that. So I like to subvert in the Spellsinger series as many of those traditional fantasy tropes as possible. A couple of examples. There are the fairies who are too fat to fly. So our hero, John Tom, puts them on an exercise program, and they lose weight, and they're very grateful. And then there's the gay unicorn. The bad guys set this unicorn on our trapped heroine of the moment, in the thought that he'll do some damage or kill her or something. And because he's gay, he's not interested in her at all. He's looking for a sturdy Percheron. And every time I come, I take a standard fantasy idea and subvert it. Robert Asprin did this in his myth books, Piers Anthony in his Xanth books, and neither of which I had read much, by the way. But that was my idea behind Spellsinger. I wanted to do fantasy, but I didn't want to do conventional fantasy.
Was that a bit of an outlet for you, having written so many things that were so serious, or maybe some of your film work, that was very exacting? Was this a way to kind of stretch out a little bit and do some things that you had always kind of wanted to let your hair down and do?
Every once in a while, I get the urge to do something different just to challenge myself. In that case, at that point in time, I had not written a fantasy. I had written nothing but science fiction. And so when I decided to write a fantasy, I just thought that I would do something different. And that's something that's never changed. One year I decided I wanted to try a historical novel. So I wrote a book called Maori about 19th century New Zealand. And then I wanted to do a contemporary novel. So I wrote a book called Primal Shadows set in New Guinea. And on with nonfiction and westerns. And if you don't challenge yourself as a writer, one way or another, even if the project is not successful, you get stale. At least I think I get stale. Some writers write nothing but in one genre and do very well and are very happy with it. I'm not like that. I have to try something different every once in a while.
Well, and you said even if that thing isn't successful, but sometimes you learn something from that experience that then it empowers you later on while you're doing something else that maybe you wouldn't have been prepared for if you hadn't taken that risk and done something different at the time.
I don't know. I don't look on it and say, well, I'm going to write a contemporary novel, and maybe that will help my science fiction. It's all writing to me. It's all storytelling. And even the nonfiction is storytelling. So I just plunge ahead with it and do it without the thought that it might or might not influence something else. I leave that to the readers to say, well, since he wrote such and such, maybe his writing in this series is better. That's something for readers to decide. It's just like with composing classical music. It's like, well, I've never written a symphony. I've written incidental music and ballets. If you don't try the symphony, you'll never know if you can write one. And you'll never know if you'd be any good at writing symphonies.
Right. I think a lot of new writers would love to imagine having a long and illustrious writing career like you've had over 40 years now. Are there any things that you've learned along the way that you think would be good advice for someone who is seeking longevity in the business?
The obvious thing is keep writing. Don't be discouraged. I have met people who have been writing all their lives who weren't lucky enough to sell immediately and who stayed with it and who eventually published. Or people who thought about writing for many years but never even tried it and then turned out to be brilliant writers. A prime example would be R.A. Lafferty, who didn't start writing, who's an electrical engineer, and didn't start writing until he was in his 50s, if I recall correctly. I remember reading my first Lafferty short stories and thinking, this is some whacked-out guy in his early 20s, totally stoned on his bed in Haight-Ashbury, churning this stuff out. And it's this, portly electrical engineer from Tulsa, Oklahoma. But he didn't start until late. So the primary piece of advice is never give up. The second one is, whatever you feel like writing, whether it's fantasy or science fiction or mysteries or nonfiction, is read a lot of what you want to write, because it will give you a better feel for the field and for what you want to do. Also, the last thing you want to do is spend 2 years writing a science fiction novel and send it into a publisher and have it come back with a nice letter saying, this is really nicely written, but it's the same thing Ross Rocklin published in Astounding in 1932. So you have to know your predecessors. You have to know what was done before you. And you have to know what's being done now, too.
One listener asked when some of your older work would be available in ebook format, and I just checked Amazon, and it looks like most of your older works are available especially for the Kindle now. Is there any news on kind of your back catalog transition digital?
It keeps coming out in dribs and drabs. It's Open Road Media is doing a lot of stuff. The Damn Trilogy, those 3 books will be out very soon. In fact, I put the cover up on my website just for this month. And so eventually everything should show up. It's just a question of publishers, ebook publishers, finding the time to do it, and then getting the rights reverted if the original publisher doesn't want to do it with their ebook division, and having somebody do it, transcribe it. So I think everything will show up eventually, but there's quite a bit out there now. There's a lot more than there was 5 years ago, certainly. And I think as time goes on, everything will show up sooner or later. If people want a specific title available as an ebook, the best thing they can do is write people like Open Road Media and the publishers of the original books and say, when will this be available as an ebook?
Right. And I guess some of those titles, it's a little tougher because, like you said, someone's having to literally transcribe that because there was not a Word, a Microsoft Word copy of the book laying around to just be converted to Kindle.
Right. For example, again, Open Road Media did the Ice Rigger trilogy as one volume, which is something I always wanted to see done since those 3 books virtually comprise one big book. Book one, the last line of book 1 basically leads into book 2 and so on, even though they were written over a period of 10 years. So they're all available in one, if you will, volume now, but none of them were available as electronic copies. They were all done on a typewriter. So somebody at Open Road had to sit there and retype all of those books. So the oldest titles are the hardest ones to get into print. If you have a nice, clean electronic copy of your book, it's much easier to interest a publisher in doing an ebook version of it because there's essentially no work for them.
Excellent. Mr. Foster, thank you so much for coming on the show today. What new is coming up from you? Because I know that you're steadily putting out new content all the time. What can we look forward to?
I get bored if I don't tell stories, so people are stuck with it. A bunch of short stuff. You just have to look at various anthologies that are coming out. As far as books go, in late August or early September, the next Flinx and Pip book called Strange Music will be out. Next year, Del Rey will be doing a standalone science fiction novel, not Commonwealth, called Reliquary, which is about the last human being in the galaxy. And then prior to that, starting in May, the novelization of Alien Covenant will be out, which is the next Alien film. And I'm currently finishing up a prequel novel to that film, which will fit between Prometheus and Alien Covenant.
Wow.
So
very busy.
I also have a book which I finished, which is at my agent's right now, called Secretions, which 14-year-old boys will love based on the title alone.
Yes, I'm sure they will. And your website you mentioned earlier is alandeanfoster.com. Is that the best place for people to go and discover your work?
I think so. There's all the interesting background information on the Commonwealth, the chronology of all the Commonwealth books with other details about the stories, maps of the Commonwealth, information on all the other books. Of course, there's bibliographies of everything I've written as far as I've been able to keep track of it, and pictures from my travels that people can look at. It's I know there are at least 2 fans who have fun looking at those pictures and then trying to find specific scenes and specific books that are taken from that particular picture. So that's in there as well. So it's kind of a fun place to bounce around and look at different things. I updated I do a monthly update with forthcoming books and stories and such, author-related stuff as I can keep in mind, including what's going on with the 8 cats and the 2 dogs.
Nice. I'll put a link to it in the show notes, and it sounds like we have an Easter egg hunt to go through those pictures and see if we can figure out where you've included those in stories. Thank you, Mr. Foster, for coming on the show. It's been a great privilege, and thank you for being so generous with your time.
It was fun, Hank.
Stay tuned now for this audio clip from Richard Gleaves, General of the Dead. You can pick up the entire Jason Crane series at Amazon.com. There's a link in the show notes.
How do we know when we are watched? Do the eyes of a predator reflect moonlight, focusing it on our skin? Do we feel 2 little spots of white on our neck and bristle with fear? I knew I was watched, and I could feel its quality. A man's gaze, like yearning eyes in a smoky tavern. I felt drawn to it. I skirted the pond, and beneath a vine-choked bower, I found the horseman's severed head. The braid at the back had snagged on some twig, turning the dead eyes upward. A dragonfly rode his cheek. It fled as I reached for him. I took hold of his braid, like the vine of a pumpkin, and drew him from the water. We sat together on a mossy log, he and I. Oh, I felt such joy to look upon his face again. I wiped the mud from his lips and nostrils, preparing him to be buried. The Domine could not watch the graveyard always, I decided. I would wait for night to fall, steal a shovel, and do the work myself. A trio of colonial soldiers were raising a redoubt nearby. Thomas the gravedigger brought them his own long-handled shovels. He stood and watched the soldiers work with professional interest, as dirt was his trade. Autumn leaves snagged in his hair, but he was too busy tale-telling to notice. The morning's dark business had quite bewitched his imagination. But the big one was a Hessian. One of them horsemen, head lopped off by a cannonball. He'll be a-haunting this place now, he will, with a hip-hip and a clippity-clop. I'll be seeing headless spooks in my burying ground. Just you wait. And if he can't find his own head, he'll be wanting one of ours. Lord love us. He shivered, hands in pockets. The soldiers laughed at him, but the boy was serious. Our legend had begun to spin itself already, from the lips of our tow-headed gravedigger. Fact and fiction going their separate ways, severed, as they often are. I listened with fascination. I had always loved a ghost story, and I'd never witnessed the birth of one before. Ghost stories are a form of history. If we say, 3 men died building that church and they forever haunt it, we keep those souls alive in death. Ghost stories are the past bleeding into the present, demanding acknowledgement of those unseen presences all around us, in our street names and genealogies and on our crumbling headstones. The tragedy of Old Willow, the fall of the horseman, the fate of you or I. These tales are forgotten by academic historians, who chronicle only great men. But our small lives are remembered, so long as our ghost stories are told. That is why we must tell them and retell them, and keep them kindled in the hearts of our children.
You've been listening to the Author Stories podcast with Hank Garner. You can find all of the archives of the show over at hankgarner.com. When you're there, please subscribe to the show and leave a comment over on iTunes or Google Play. You can even subscribe at YouTube and Stitcher Radio. Thanks for listening.